started.
Okay, great. So, Alfred, you can see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, it's fine.
Great. Okay, we'll just go ahead and get started. I want to once again thank Alfred for organizing this conference. I know you spent 2 days already with a lot of great talks, I'm sure, and apologizing coming in at this very end. But we'll be here as we finish my talk, Akin, and we look forward to our good friend and colleagues' uh, culminating keynote for the conference, Ian Thompson's talk. So thank you all for being here. I have to say that I'm going on a limb by taking on this topic, Conscience is the Call of Care, Chapter 2, Division 2. I'm embarrassed to say after 30 years of studying, being in time, and trying to work on it, that I really haven't spent much time in this chapter. So this is really kind of new for me. And if I make a lot of mistakes, I apologize. And please correct me and correct the understanding. But we will focus on this particular phrase within section 57. There's 56 of them, 5 sections in chapter 2 of division 2 on resoluteness and Schlosenheit. But I want to get to a point where I can discuss this particular section 57. Okay. But before I do, this may sound like, okay, we're supposed to talk about Heidegger, but we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about all these other background sources, resources. And I do this only because I want to show a contrast. Heidegger is not only referring to many of these figures, as we'll see, but we're not just here to learn about the past or the history of philosophy, but we want to understand how is Heidegger responding to them, appropriating them, inheriting them, but also distinguishing himself. So we'll look at Plato, Aristotle, a little bit of the Gospels, Kierkegaard, and then, of course, we won't be able to get to the many other figures that are very prominent in the entire work. May not be in these sections particularly, but of course throughout Division 2. We may allude to them a bit, but not directly as we will the other previously mentioned figures. Okay. Real quickly, before we get to the background sources, just an anatomy of the chapter 2 on attestation and resoluteness. Section 54, how to attest to an authentic potentiality for being a Dasein. Sorry, there are 5 sections. There's 7 sections starting at 54. How to attest to an authentic potentiality for being a Dasein. In this attestation, authentic possibility for Dasein to be is given. The attestation is given to Dasein to understand. So that's good. With the attestation for the authentic potentiality for Dasein's being is given to Dasein itself to understand. And therefore the attestation is rooted in Dasein's being. And just to remind ourselves, some of us take a very radicalized view. When we want to emphasize this kind of constant reminder as critique, there's no present or at hand I or self. If you recall from chapter 4, division 1 on the who question, the equiprimordial structures of the who Dasein is, fundamental state is being in the world, before we get to care and death and temporality and historicality of fate. In division 2, we go back to division 1, we have to think of the Dasein with other Daseins, with being. So what does it mean to be with, not just others, but being with as a fundamental construction of being in the world. With world, we're always with the world, as long as we're in it. Being oneself, that doesn't mean just being me or being alone or saying this is who I am or this is my name. I'm Raj Sampath, Rajesh. And of course, the Dustman, which my colleague Ian Wars reminded me, even though I want to separate the Dustman, is constitutive of the entire project of being in the world. It's not just inescapable for a lot of necessary reasons, but it's constitutive. You have to understand what that constitutive connection is. But chapter 2, when we get to division 2 on resoluteness, and the conscience is the color care. We know it comes after chapter 1 on death, and it's before chapter 3 on temporality, ecstatic, primordial, finite temporality. It's important we keep that in mind, that it has a specific place in the launch of the division 2. It's not just a connector of death and time, but it's in many respects, for some, I think for a lot of scholars, much to say, much to illuminate for not just the entire idea of an existential analytic, but what we mean by the existential and existentialism in general for Heidegger as an ontological matter, not just the ontic ideas of existentialism. Okay, so here's the background, and if we want a charitable reading of the greats of the past, which we know Heidegger pays so much respect and homage to the great figures of the past, despite his breakthrough, despite his differentiation, his suspension from this tradition, his appropriation of it, the handing down of this tradition of Heidegger, but there's a forgetfulness of this question of being that begins with Western metaphysics. That's his critique. We all know that. But in the same token, even in the early period, there's this tremendous kind of relationship and connection. And for me, a set of family resemblances, an eeriness, an uncanny set of patterns where there's already much there to be appropriated, as Heidegger tells us, that almost looks very Heideggerian in these very ancient guys. So let's try to come back to these past figures with this Heideggerian lens, but also make the contrast that we need to see them in Heidegger that makes Heidegger unique. For Plato's Phaedo, we have a body of writings that talks about Socrates and his death, his trial. Socrates makes a distinction between the philosopher willing to die and suicide as a taking of one's own life and body. So as a project of metaphysics, it's not just a question of the extinguishing of physical life, perishing for Heidegger. The willingness to die. What is it? What is he talking about? His friends told him, look, you really don't have to take the poison. You can escape. And I know Athens is mad at you, but we really don't have a tradition of killing someone like you. There's a little escape hatch. You can go into exile, disappear, and die that type of death. Stared out in my disgust when this works on the death penalty. He didn't have to die, and he chose to. But he also gave his arguments, as we all know. It's very famous. So the philosopher will die as opposed to suicide. The body is matter belongs to the gods. So who cares what you want to do with the body? That's essential for primordial metaphysics, ancient Greek metaphysics, at least in Plato. Also for Plato in this particular moment, the philosopher cares about the soul. For them, it migrates. May not want to say the word reincarnation, but the soul is it's detachable from the body, maybe in it, but is also detachable. But here's the key point. The philosopher who cares about the soul is not beholden to another or oneself in having one's life taken. That's very strange. This is actually happening in the text. There's a subtlety in Socrates' argument. Don't think about the other, about what I should do or not do. Speaking of conscience. Or the other saying, hey, we're going to take your life. So, okay, well, what do you think you're taking? You're going to take this body. Okay, fine. But who's deciding it? Rather, one must wait until God summons a human at the appointed time of death. Wow, that's pretty amazing. Kairos, timeliness, the moment of vision, free and anxious to be ready for that possibility to bring us out of it. And by deduction, not confuse that appointed time with control over one's body, which is falsely free, even if one averts a death sentence. So think about all the ontic possibilities of how Socrates could have thought about this. Oh my God, I don't want to die. It's going to be terrible. And what am I going to do? I'm trapped in this body that's going to be asleep forever. Or, oh, they're telling me I can escape. Oh, this is just a fake death sentence. Why am I doing it? This is why do I have to listen to all these people anyway? Whether they're telling me you're going to die. That's the Athenian court. Or his friends. What are you doing? His family. What are you doing? Don't do this. So there's a kind of a distinction being made here, which is great. Okay, so if we think about this foreshadowing from Heidegger, we know about the ontological difference. being towards death and ontic biological perishing. I'm trembling in fear because we have the expert with us, Professor Ian Thompson, who's I'm looking forward to his comments and his keynote discussion. But this profound distinction being made in Heidegger. And then don't forget, even more subtly, the intermediate distinction inside it between perishing, a life ending in this world, or burning out of this world, the life leaving, expiring, dying, and finally biological death. But that experience of demising, it's not quite perishing, but also not dying authentically, which is what Heidegger cares about. And then what I tend to do is whenever I read anything in Heidegger prior to section 65 on temporality and eventually chapter 5 on movement, historicality, it's based in chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, and of course chapter 6, the last chapter. So yes, and most of my time. But for me, I can't think about any of these issues if I'm not already also racing ahead, wondering what's he talking about? Movement and motion, the stretchedness of the whole life, the wholeness of Dasein, which he hasn't gotten to. He says, oh, up to this point, the beginning of chapter 5, talked about. Have I really gotten to this whole? Oh, by the way, I've only talked about one end, being towards death. What about being towards birth? Dasein goes towards two ends. What the heck does that mean? How can you go to the being towards the birth end, being towards the end? All pointing to this excruciatingly complex problem of him trying to understand the very finitude of temporality as a process, temporalizing. Linear time just comes out of this, it's derived. So why do we think of being in time, falling in time, getting older, you know, thinking about our death date somewhere there in the future, hopefully further away there right now. That's all inauthentic, derivative, spatialized now points, which he admittedly gets his start from Aristotle's physics book, raising all those enigmas of Porteous paradoxes. And time is a reduction to now points. Okay, so what's the consequence here for Heidegger? The relation of being in time as an event undergirds the entire interrelated problematic conscience, uncanniness, anxiety, resoluteness. Okay, so that's how I look at chapter 2 as obviously sitting within the whole of division 2. But since I'm not an expert in this, then it's kind of disingenuous to just pass over this extremely important chapter. I'm already just trying to situate myself in chapter 3 on temporality, and then eventually chapters 4, 5, and 6. But what we can say is that there's no evidence of any prior thinker in the Western tradition making these kinds of connections within chapter 2 already. A lot of allusions to previous thinkers. Nietzsche will show it too. Don't forget that, with the good conscience and the bad conscience. And then, as others can tell you, also, so chapter 2 in itself is unique, with the kind of contributions Heidegger's making with regard to the history of Western philosophy. But also that original leading in death. Not just what death is, that's not the question he's posing, but its constitutive place it plays as a possibility inside Dasein itself. And then the grounding of Dasein as being in care, the care, of course, would come to be rooted in temporality. The meaning of Dasein's being is temporality, right from the introduction. Okay, now I'll do a little bit of Aristotle. You might say, well, this is kind of moving us away from at least this question of death and conscience in Plato. Well, why are you going to go over here, especially this last section, book 10, very end of the Nicomachean Ethics. It's my favorite part, the combination of what the definition of metaphysics is. It's a divine science, as he states in the metaphysics itself, but this is the ethics. So after going through all these other things about virtue and happiness and justice and friendship and all the ways you can think about ethics and morality, human beings and what they do in the world, this is where he ends up as being a contemplative activity. Either thoughts of the divine or thoughts as divine and most divine in us, that's perfect virtue, proper virtue, and perfect happiness. But this is a continuous contemplation of truth, specific to the philosophy or the metaphysician. which is more continuous than any other action. So the metaphysical component here, about continuity, motion, movement, beginning and ending. Talk about this, passing time, not linear time, but just, Heidegger talks about using up your time, counting for it or reckoning it. He wants to get to that mystery, deep in division two. But passing the time, at least for Aristotle, more pleasantly through this knowledge, you can get to it. Most people can't. They don't. They go through these other phases of intelligence, is ethics, making good decisions. Scientists, they want to know what exists. Practical wisdom is techne, how do you craft things and do things and carve things out to make things useful for yourself. I'm simplifying it. Understanding, wow, that's an important area. First causes of the universe. No, remember, there's something greater than all these. It's wisdom. The divine science, it has to be a science of the divine, would have to be a divine science itself. It's the greatest, but probably the most useless. And that's the beginning of metaphysics. That's the kind of knowledge. I'm not in Sesame for Manuel's question. The philosopher realm is self-sufficient in this activity compared to the just human, the politician or the leader, that still needs to act towards others and get that recognition. Philosophia, love for its own sake, very, very complex matter. Not just the etymology from philosophia, but the fact that it's for its own sake, nothing arises from it other than the act of contemplation. That's novel to me. Think about that. So, in contrast to practical activities, which actions are doing with without contemplation. Okay, so reason is the divine as its life, in contrast to human life, mortal things being mortal. And there's a little subterranean moment here. It's not a direct question posed by Aristotle, but we can tease it out. Basically, he's saying, if you knew what this is, any of us, if we can even get to this, why would you want to do something? Why would you want to choose something else? Some other definition about happiness through other activities. What would be other to pure happiness? Like just speaking very simply here, almost like a child. Like if something really makes you happy, why would you want something other than that? Okay. Some more Aristotle, and we'll do the contrast with Heidegger. In all other virtues which link people to each other to their activities, the practical immanent rules over life. Whereas in contemplation, no requirement of others is required, except the pursuit of truth alone. Now, of course, we know Aristotle's model, especially his master-slave economy. You've got to rely on others to survive in this world. You've got to do work. You've got to work for others. You've got to get paid. Or if you can make it happen in this economy, get someone else to do it for it. So you can free up the space. But if you can free up the space, contemplation and pure freedom, that's what he brings. Not human beings, the mortals have, but only a God can have. There's a funny moment in Aristotle where it says gods are beings above all other beings, they're blessed and happy. No mortal actions can be ascribed to them. That would be silly. Acts of even justice in his ancient Greek world, or technical production of commodities, or making contracts or money. Why would you want to reduce a god to those kinds of things? They're going to sit there and squabble over a contract. If you strip away all action and production from a living being, then what's left? The answer is contemplation. So for Aristotle, who can possibly, approach this level of the divine or this blessedness and happiness without all these other activities getting in? It's the philosopher. What does a philosopher do? Make contracts, make money? I guess we have to, but to survive. That's not what we're doing. Philosopher is dearest to the gods insofar as the philosopher is akin to them. It's a race 2,500 years old, 2,200 years later, we get to, or less, let's see, over 2,000, 2,100 years after. So, get to Heidegger. Dasein is an entity that is not present at hand, so not in the world doing all those ontic things. Through the phenomenological reduction, the nothing, which my colleague Ian and many others will try to teach us and illuminate us. We don't think that this is privation or just absence of present at hand, or nothing like my jar is empty. There's a positivity here. It's an ecstatic, revealing an abyssal kind of organ that allows us to even come into this space And it's very positive. It's not something that you just like cut it off my hand or something. It's not that type of thing. It's not entropy. It's not the 0 point of just complete evaporation of time. But for Heidegger, when we get into our chapter 2 here, with division 2, section 57, the nothing that inhabits the question of who the caller is in its appeal to Dasein. He's always asking, who's calling to Dasein back to itself? Dasein's going to make this call, but Dasein from its radical individuation, its uncanny as it throws. Dasein's also the truth. It's from chapter 6, division 1. I don't care if you recall that. Not predicated truth. Not philosophy, subject-object relations. Not correspondence. Therefore, not some kind of ontology is logic. It's something much more primordial and profound. I won't have time to go into this, but just a reminder that in the metaphysics, you do get a more elaborate definition of what was just discussed in the Nicomachean Ethics about God being the ultimate and absolute, but God is life, is actuality, is thought thinking itself. Hegel picks up on this and adds more words anyway, back to this basic distillate, much of these Hegel and Aristotle, a pure concept conceptually comprehending itself, but from a free concrete existence. I'm going to get into Hegel, but something is going on here about this being as the truth or in the truth as an actuality. All right, sharp pivot, and then we will get to Heidegger, 1251. We have an hour, so we have plenty of time for a discussion on Heidegger. I can't have a conversation about Heidegger, not because I want to talk about Heidegger and theology and religion. We all want to talk about the theological constitution of metaphysics in the West. And at least since the advent of Christianity, the interpenetration of Christian themes into Western metaphysics by all the great Western thinkers, up to Heidegger himself. But why these sections in the Passion narrative, in the Garden of the Agony? Kierkegaard, who we'll get to, picks up on this, since Jesus is saying, okay, well, I got to go die. I'm done having the Passover with my friends. And they're asleep in the garden. I told them to stay awake and watch, but that's who they are. So here I am by myself. My soul was exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. Tarry here, ye here much with me. He's speaking of himself as if they're already asleep. Then he turns to his father, whoever that is. Further fell on his face, prayed, oh, my father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from you. Possible. Is possible. We'll get to Heidegger and his possibility, the impossibility. But what's this possible for Jesus? Let this cup pass from you. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. So it's not what I want. It's not what I think. And don't let this day self get in my way and tell me what to think about all this. I don't even trust myself. Because what if that's the day self? But he's talking to his father. This I take from Luke because it's this proleptic of obviously what's going to happen on the cross with the thorns, but it's just, you don't need to be a Christian or a mystic or just read it like a myth if you will. It's just the literality of this. Think about this. Whose sweat turns is so profound from angst and anxiety and agony about what they're comporting themselves towards in their mood to accept, and their sweats turn into blood. So if it's metaphoric or not, it's just a fascinating idea of this temporalization. Being in agony, you pray in verse. Praying in agony will turn your sweat into blood. All right, so we know from Heidegger, because he makes a very explicit statement, especially in this chapter 2, that despite my own inclination, which is to maybe sometimes overly conflate Heidegger with theological themes, Heidegger, if you can listen to him and maintain fidelity to his text, he'll tell you, look, I'm not talking about a mysterious voice. If you go to the endnotes, he's making it very clear that, he knows what's happening in theology, but he's not doing that. He's not even going to take a stand on sin, whether it's for or against it in his discussion of conscience. And you'll see what he has to say about Kierkegaard. But He's not just simply repeating and metaphysicalizing and philosophizing Christian theology. Some people may say that, but I'm convinced more than ever that it's just you can't do that to Heidegger. It's not right. There's something else happening here. Being towards death, definition of death is possibility and impossibility. You know that in chapter 1. What does that mean? Possibility no longer being in the world. Non-relational, not to be outstripped, the uttermost, distinctively impending. All the phrases and words from the sections in chapter 1. Okay. Now, the fourth gospel, John, is important here again before we get to Heidegger. I promise we will eventually get to the chapter 2 on the conscience. But I want to highlight these places here. Once again, the Gospel of John, which is different from the Synoptics because you have roughly 4 chapters after the dinner, after the Passover, before the arrest, when Judas' betrayal. He's talking away, Jesus, not to the disciples. He's talking to the Father. But those few little cryptic statements in the Synoptic Gospels, my soul is sorrowful unto death. Oh, I don't want to do this. Take this away from me. Oh, okay, now I better do this. It's true. On the phone. Sweat turning into blood. This blows up into a whole discourse, which makes John quite unique. What's he saying here? So keep this in mind. I am no more. Now I am no more in the world. But these are the disciples, and they come to be. While I was with them in the world, with Daseins, with the world, being with, I kept them in my name, your name. I've given them your word. The world has hated them because they're not of the world, even as I'm not of the world. In the world, but not of it. He's not going out. He's not just perishing. Leaving the world, as Heidegger says. He's no longer in it. What does that mean? It's a possibility. But don't attribute any context to that. Don't even do this to Jesus right here. He hasn't gotten to the death and the resurrection yet. That's Christianity. So what's he talking about? I pray that don't take them out of the world, keep them here. They got to testify. They're not of the world, even as I'm not of the world. Sanctify them through thy truth. Thy word is truth. What I'm trying to highlight here is this: he's articulating that he's no longer in the world, but we don't have an ontological sense of what that is, especially if we don't want to go down the Christian route. You want to keep following the story and the narrative. You know what happens. He's going to die. And he dies terribly, and then we get a happy ending. He's resurrected. And that's the picture thinking that every great philosopher since at least Kant, but Hegel, Schelling, Nietzsche, Heidegger himself, they're not going to accept that. They're going to do something different. So inscribing Heidegger's ideas and being time about the possibility of anticipating no longer being in the world as a being towards death, that has nothing to do with physical dying. This is the moment where Jesus is on the cross. Therefore, we hint at the resurrection from the dead. This is Christian onto-theological metaphysics is not going to get us to the finitude that Heidegger is concerned about. And maybe prior to him, Schelling, bracket Hegel, because people don't interpret Hegel as a philosopher of finitude. He's outfavoring that to get to some absolute. Let's just bracket that first. Heidegger for sure. To empty any content of what's like not being in the world, that's, as a reduction, that's very difficult. Not, we can ontically, while we're still here, alive, imagine, what we could just pretend is, oh, we're not going to be in the world. What's our funeral going to be like? What are our friends going to be saying at our funeral? What music are they going to play? That's all present at hand as an event emanating from my lived experience right now in this chronological present. We're not going there. Rather, we got to get to this abyssal uncanniness that discloses the there-ness of being at one's time. So there's the ontological project, which we're going to get to for Heidegger. There's Jesus, but we got one more step. Kierkegaard, essential. Essential for being in time, essential for division 2, essential for the sections after death, particularly in, as I'll get to here, he shows up in chapter 4 on the everyday registers of temporality, but not this chapter 2 on resoluteness. Well, what's Kierkegaard saying? Specifically in Sickness Unto Death. Consciousness of self is not self-consciousness or consciousness of consciousness. It's Kierkegaard, once again, trying his best to respond to Hegel. This is not a conversation about whether he's accurate or can pull it off. I don't happen to think that he gets Hegel right. I think Hegel's far more complicated, but it is what it is. This is what he's really getting at. The disrelationship between the finite and the infinite. The self's relation to itself is false. So first of all, a kind of false sense of the finite. And if one is scared about being finite, whether one clings to it or flees from it, that cannot help us handle this disrelationship that's inherent in the self itself, in its relationship to itself. Not so much the relationship between the self and the infinite or God, not some simplistic subject-object relationship. He's not about the self's relationship to itself. There's this inherent disrelationship in which the finite and the infinite is disturbed already within this self. This gives rise to the despair in relation to an authentic self that's trying to transcend itself and also try to overcome that despair. Kierkegaard's going to root this in conscience, and this conscience is nothing but a relation before God. Now you might think, oh, is that the dogmatic Christian just trying to do good so they can get the afterlife? Or keeping up all the sacraments, if you're Catholic, for example, and clearing your conscience and saying, okay, I'm good. No, but we know that the existential project Kierkegaard obviously is critiquing the type of public Christianity, or we can call it the Christianity of the day. There's something more profound here. Conscience is not simply moral failure, actual sinning, and then feeling guilty. Failing to be one before God. Now that's very, very, what does it mean to be one before God? And failing to be that. The temporal distortion of finite and the infinite exacerbates. So if you think about this in Kierkegaard, even to be fair to him, in his complexity, it's not due to a fear of physical death or a superficial quest for immortality, living on beyond, just some kind of extended nature, just being what we are right now, but getting to do that forever. And he's not talking about that. The anxiety of the misalignment, we're going to contrast this with Heidegger's inauthenticity and fallenness. For Kierkegaard, it's the either or, wanting to be oneself as oneself is either dependent or independent of God. But that's not authentic being before God. So there's already a lot going on here just in Kierkegaard. There's this disrelationship between the finite and infinite. This happens when the self tries to relate to itself. If you try to move too quickly and overcome that despair, you're going to have some false dogmatic faith. Don't want that. If you don't care, then you're going to get surprised. You're going to get sick, maybe die someday, or experience a dying process. It's not talking about that. He's just saying, we human beings are weird. We're cursed with this transcendence and the freedom, which is our anxiety. But it also points to something deeper that's not dogmatic with regard to why we have this despair in terms of this disrelationship, just within ourselves. Okay, long story short, some non-dogmatic form of faith may become possible for Kierkegaard. This is not a space to talk about Kierkegaard religion. We're too complicated of a subject. But that's not the case for Heidegger. And as I mentioned, if you looked at chapter 2 in the endnotes, everybody else shows up. That's what's so fascinating. Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche. You may not know a theologian named Kahler, but early 20th century thoughts in theology was, besides Karl Barth, the guy, Bultmann, there's several major figures that are doing all kinds of very interesting things about the very historicity of the historical Jesus as a kind of threat to dogmatic theology. Basically, theologians of Finitude, if you want to call them that. Scheller, the great Scheller, and of course, Jaspers, the interlocutor and the major protagonist in the early Heidegger, with, of course, Husserl being the teacher. But Jaspers is the right there, to birth of being a town, and especially in the kid. But no Kierkegaard. He shows up in chapter 4 of Division 2 on temporality and division. Remember that? The end note. But what do we get? Oh, yeah, he's the guy that saw the farthest in terms of the existential, and he's deep. But let's be honest, this is Heidegger saying, he falls prey to the inauthentic vision. First of all, being in time in his Ethikkeit, and of course, his commitment to the natural. Heidegger has committed first, expelled, recuperating Aristotle, reappropriating, as he says. in a profoundly ontological way. So in conclusion, these past quotes from both theology and religion and the philosophers in the Western tradition, let's see what you have to say. But Heidegger's uniqueness and irreducibility becomes defensible. And I think in homage to your conference, Alfred, that's what we're trying to. We all want to, refresh ourselves, reinvigorate ourselves with this very basic insight, but also just be overwhelmed by it again. Like, wow, this is what who is Heidegger? Who did he, how did he do, what is he doing? How did he do this? He could have just repeated what other people have done. Okay, so now how do we distinguish there? Now that we have some background, how do we distinguish this? This is where I'm coming up on, I hope to be done in about 10 minutes. So just, if you can indulge me for 10 more minutes. As you know, as he opens up chapter 2, the very famous voice of conscience, he's going to go to great lengths, to say it's dialectic. We're not going to be talking about the psychological, biological. We already got done talking about some theology, both in Kierkegaard and the Natural Gospels. But what's I love to tease out some of the initial kind of definitions, propositional structures. Very complicated. Conscience is by no means any fully developed version of it. That comes later in chapter 2. But conscience is a call. It's going to turn to be the call of care, but to a mode of discourse, to trying to be keeping silent, that is it. To an appeal, being a summons, almost like is it an appeal to a court? I've been summoned to jury duty. I've been summoned to court because I myself been go to court because someone's claiming I'm guilty. But this is initial kind of conscience to the call, to the mode of discourse, to the appeal, but to own most being guilty. That's what we want to come to, it's being guilty. If you recall in this chapter, he has these 4 registers of what people might think he means by that, and all these objections. Like, don't you mean being guilty is this, or it's that, or this, or that? And he just goes through all of them and says, nope, that sounds appealing. Being guilty means this, but he's not talking about it. Rather, wanting to have a conscience is choosing to choose. As he says earlier, is not choosing to deal with this yourself and what it all means and what you want to be responsible for. And come on, take a hold of yourself. Don't just. You can do nothing and not think if you don't want to, or you can go with the Das Man and just everybody else will tell you what to do. You want to transvaluate all previous values. So if you don't choose to do this, that's a type of choice, as I said. So you don't want that. So you got to choose to, wanting to have a conscience. That's choosing to choose to be oneself. In that call to a mode of discourse, to answer the appeal, you're going to hear something, and I'm not going to know much about the caller. It's not Jesus talking to the Father or Aristotle's divine. You're not going to hear words like, oh, you got to do this, you got to do that, or, this literally hear some other voice besides yourself. So we're going to get to that. It's first of all, let's just say it's choosing to choose, kind of being oneself, given the fourfold of the Dasein with being oneself, obeying the equiprimordial kind of interpenetration of this from chapter division 1. But this is the first attempt to define resoluteness. And in Schlossenheit, the Erschlossen and the Entschlossen. But, our English doesn't really help. There's any others to help me with this, but I don't even know how to immerse myself in the Entschlossenheit, so I'm going to need the Germans too. But for me, resoluteness it's really, if you're not careful, it can become very ontic very quickly. And we don't want to do that. It's so resolute. I absolutely have to go do this thing, and I don't want to listen to anyone else. And I'm going to be stubborn like Trump and say, why do I need morality? I have the moral values. Why do I need someone else's definition of peace? I can tell you what peace is. That's not that. That's stupid resolution and result. We're not talking about, so resoluteness to me is too anodyne. Here's chapter two. You already know this. I won't read this, but I'm honing in at 57. If I can get there. But um, in order to really develop the 57 conscious public care, and for the sake of time, I do want to at least jump ahead a bit, and I will conclude with that section 57. But we're going to take a little bit from 60, which is the last section, because we're going to come back to the resoluteness. The comprehensive, overarching, this is not right. I should have spent the whole hour taking us from sections 54, 55, 56. Here I'm jumping all the way to the end, but I just want to put it out there, and I'll do my conclusions in 57. The disclosedness of Dasein and wanting to have a conscience is thus constituted by anxiety as a state of mind, by understanding as a projection of oneself upon one's own being guilty, and by discourse as reticence. The distinctive and authentic disclosedness, which is attested in Dasein itself by its conscience, this reticent self-projection upon one's own most being guilty, in which one is ready for anxiety, we call resoluteness. Now we get the fully developed and concluding definition of it. Before he moves on to chapter three, we'll really flesh out that Dasein's being as care is rooted in temporality. And we got to stop here. This is also within 60, because we can't just end with resoluteness, but we're going to look at back to the problem of truth. Let me just read this. Resoluteness is a distinctive note of Dasein's disclosedness, the being of the there, if you will, the disclosedness, not disclosing something, but just the clearing, so I can be the there. And there's on space. I'm not there in this building, and I'll be there 10 o'clock tomorrow. But the very clearing the possibility of being there. In the earlier passage, however, we interpret disclosedness existentially as primordial truth. So look at this notation. Again, not the history of philosophy or thought. Truth is primarily a quality of judgment or a definite way of behaving, comportment, being true, being honest, but something essentially constituted for being in the world. Wow. Remember Jesus in the no longer in the world, abiding the truth. The Lord is truth. Truth must be conceived as a fundamental existential and ontological clarification of the proposition that Dasein is in the truth. That was already in chapter 6, division 1 on care. Also in the untruth. Remember that? The fallenness. We have called attention to the primordial disclosedness of this entity as a truth of existence. And for delimitation of its character, we referred to the analysis of Dasein's authenticity. He's trying to get some grounding here. Again, sorry to come back to the Gospels, but it's just all important here. If you recall, during the trial, he's got everybody questioning him. The Jewish leadership had already questioned him. They've given him up to the Pilate, the governor, and Herod, the false king. It was a kind of like lieutenant that's put in place by the Romans to run Judea, Herod. He meets both of them, right? And they're asking a bunch of questions. He says nothing. They keep repeating these areas. He says nothing. Never answered them a word. Herod questions. He answered nothing. But then in John, he does say this at least, right before they're literally going to execute. I've come to bear witness to the truth, and everyone who hears the truth hears my voice. And the Pilate asks, what is truth? But to that question, he gives nothing. That awesome space of silence. Yeah. Imagine inhabiting the silence when there's no answer to the question. The power. And Heidegger says this too throughout the chapter. It's like, hey, when someone remains silent, they have a lot to say. They're more powerful than you think, that alien power. But let's contrast this with Nietzsche's will to power. And this is Heidegger, of course, will go on in the 30s to make his critique. But you know how the genealogy and moral ends. Nietzsche's busy too. What's this will to truth and the will to even having a will? Of course, his own maxim, the will to power, which Heidegger will call that the last metaphysical concept. But if you remember at the end, you can deconstruct everything, and all these are the previous systems of values and where good conscience comes from. It comes from pain and repetition and debt. That's all in the genealogy of morals, or the false asceticism of the priestly classes in Christianity. But if you take away everything, man would rather will nothing than not will, and hence the problem of nihilism for Nietzsche, not as the end stage, but there's even to that point, willing nothing, because you can't get rid of this will. Maybe that's the problem. Okay, almost there. Well, 1:15. I really have to wrap up here. Okay, so now I want to just last concluding definition, and then we'll do some conclusions, and then we can open it up. Now that resoluteness has been worked out as being guilty, a self-projection in which one is resident and ready for anxiety. And again, I'm going to pause here because I haven't really interpreted Heidegger yet. I've just given us all these other figures, but I've also tried to draw the contrast. Heidegger is not doing Christian theology. He's not doing Kierkegaard. He's not doing all the other guys. But Socrates saying, hey, I'm going to accept this. But it's not you getting into the dead sense. I'm choosing to do this, choosing to choose. Now that resoluteness has been worked out as being guilty, a self-projection in which one is resident, ready for anxiety, our investigation has been put in a position for defining the ontological meaning of the potentiality which we've been seeking. Dasein's authentic potentiality for being a whole, Ganzheit, Ganzen Dasein. By now, the authenticity of Dasein is neither an empty term nor an idea which someone has fabricated. But even so, as an authentic potentiality for being a whole, the authentic being towards death, which we have deduced existentially, still remains a purely existential project, for which Dasein's attestation is missing. That attestation is given to Dasein. It's in Dasein's being. That's good, but it's still missing. Only when such an attestation, testifying, has been found will our investigation suffice to exhibit an authentic potentiality for being a whole, accidentally confirmed and clarified, a potentiality which belongs to Dasein. Mm-hmm. For only when this entity has become phenomenally accessible in its authenticity and its totality will the question of the meaning of being of this entity, to whose existence there belongs and in general understanding of being, be based on something which will stand any test. And that's going to follow in chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6. Well, what's that question mean? That's the setting up fundamental ontology. That's what Being Times Existential Analytic was trying to do. Set up that possibility. We got to do this work to talk about the existential analytic before we get to fundamental ontology. But this is the main question. Question the meaning of being and the meaning of the question, as he says in the introduction. Because have we gotten any clearer about this? Do we even know that we've become perplexed by this? No. So let's repose this anew. Okay, overall conclusions here. What's Heidegger's project? Destroying that history of ontology. Destruction is not just wholly negative, it's a clearing, right, of the ontotheological constitution of metaphysics. It's from the ancient Greeks to German idealism. Ian, I know you have your very profound elaboration from your very beginnings, 20 plus years ago, of what ontotheology is, and we want to hear from you. But I can come at it in many different ways. Somehow ontos is being as a fundamental primordial relationship to truth. There's a truth to being. Truth itself is constituted by some kind of being. So that's already an ontotheological project in the very definition, very launch of metaphysics. Let's just say with Plato and Aristotle, maybe not the pre-Socratics. And that goes all the way up to Hegel, Kant through Hegel, but then the critique of the idealism, which starts with Kierkegaard and definitely by the time you get to Nietzsche, critiques everything. But don't forget this part, the metaphysicalization of theology. Augustine to Aquinas, going from time to being. And then, of course, for those guys, since they're religious, they got to arrive at the triune God. They're trying to find that philosophical justification, conceptual justification of the inherent truth that's revealed to us, which is this triune Christian God, Trinitarian God. And of course, Aquinas has a lot to say about consciousness, as you know. We may have to come back to that a bit. But that's a very practical one, if you will. Even though it's metaphysical, it's practical. It's just this inner voice that we have supplied by, the creation in us to apply the moral laws, the natural laws to any concrete situation. But Heidegger is other to all of this. The legacy of Heidegger's thoughts was other to all that has been conceived in the history of Western philosophy and the Christianity in various traditions, the ones he knew, Western Catholicism, Protestantism, Did he really grapple with the Eastern Orthodox traditions and the Greek fathers? I don't know. I don't seem to know. I don't see him engaging with Maximus the Confessor or the Greek fathers to the extent that he does. Augustine and Aquinas, Eckhart, of course, in the German mystical tradition. Here's one exception for our conversation. One great exception on the problem of conscience is it's impossible to imagine how Heidegger could have possibly understood the emancipatory depths of the Mosaic covenant, ancient Hebraic Judaism, the messianic expectation. Not just because he was a Nazi, we all know that, but he, like most Gentiles, I imagine a lot of you all, do not know Hebrew and its mysterious roots. But the Lahab, in terms of the heart, the fear God maxims, has its own complex genealogy and roots. There is something about the small voice. There's the stain of sin, but the hidden compass is two words for both compass, from what I've been told and understand, and the same root for what will become the Greek conscience, or can be compared to the Greek root for conscience, is the internal compass from within, but it's also hidden from within us, but we're straining to figure out what that is. And we're shaking in our being because we tremble with regard to the question of our own existence. This can get very philosophical, maybe even Kierkegaardian, Heideggerian. It's a separate project. Continue with Heidegger's pathways would require a greater encounter with traditions he himself did not consider. So maybe we have to move beyond, and we have been with several of our conferences, traditions outside of Judaism, Christianity in the West. But here's me. This is my last conclusion here. It is, if it's not necessary or sufficient, though, to go outside of Heidegger to complete the project of being in time, to resume the quest for fundamental ontology, then how one re-inhabits the text to write its missing division 3 remains an open possibility. And you know from the endnotes, especially when we get to where I always want to get to, and I still haven't been able to get there, chapter 6, division 2, the confrontation with Hegel, the endnotes, and Derrida's endnote 30, we've got that big chunky endnote at the end, like, resuming the discussion of Plato and Aristotle. And although he deals with Hegel, and he kind of says, well, Kant seems to juxtapose the self and time, the I and the time in this schematism. He says that it's Hegel that has the connection between the two at the very end of being in time. But then if you go to the end note, he goes, well, no, they look like Hegel, but then, if we come back to Kant, which is what he does after being in time, we can then deepen our understanding of what this grounded does on being finitude, or kind of finite freedom and transcendence is about. So I'm stopping here. And my very, very last point is that what I love about chapter 2 and division 2 is there's enough there if you move through 57, 58, 59, and 60, the objections, in which this is where we can have a very sanguine and positive and charitable idea that despite him saying that he's not talking about any kind of traditional ethics, to me, what's beautiful about chapter 2 is that there's a profound ethics. And Ian can teach us this. And if everyone wants to say there's no ethics whatsoever, even if Heidegger's saying this in the endnotes, oh my gosh, to destroy the ontic registers of the history of conscience and morality that Nietzsche might have begun with the genealogy, but he's a genealogist, and to clear that space for wanting to be responsible, more so than even Aristotle, who says, I'm not gonna worry about my contract with others. The Fürsorge, which he even speaks about in Division 1, about the Who chapter, is profoundly about even the phrase social welfare. So my question for the group then is, when Heidegger is talking about all these things, coming back, calling itself to come back from itself, even though the call comes from without and from within, that call from without and from within, and calling himself back.
Kom wel liggen, denk ik. Anders moet je hem weer uitzetten, ja? Ja? Zet je hem anders eruit? Ja.
That's the Fürsorge. That's the calling back. Don't worry. I'm wrapping up here. That tell me that the ethical relationship built into chapter 2 is not just for the, yes, the individualized uncanniness. That's the caller. There's nothing there. It's also silent because you don't want the dustman telling you how to think about that. But if it's about commitment towards being in the world, and that already involves others, then somehow we need to rethink that being in the world from the standpoint of that radicalized individualization of the uncanniness. So in other words, I think chapter 2 gives us, between the caller and the called, that reticent self-projection, which is a type of humility, to remain silent when everyone else is telling you what to do, and you're not being arrogant and bombastic and fighting them back and saying, leave me alone, and you don't know what you're talking about, I'm smarter than you. It's that taking in, not in the gesiological way, which is the adoption of sin, and the emptying out, that's the kenosis on the cross. It's also other to that, so anti-Christian, if you will, and yet the opening of a space for us to think about the ethical. Okay, I can keep going, but I want to stop here. I want to thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Well, thank you. I will make it quick. Let's move to questions or comments, and it'll take a few minutes at least for those.
Yes,
Joaquin.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you, Raj, for your exploration of the history of Western philosophy, and then focusing on Heidegger. I have a few little questions. You mentioned Socrates in the beginning and his relationship to death, and I often ask my questions: do you think that Socrates committed suicide at the hand of the state? So, since he could have escaped and he could have avoided death. It's one question. Then I think your exploration of the Gospels, especially the Gospel of John, it's a particular Gospel because there is a sentiment spoken that is not present in the other, this awareness of death in the other Gospels, and you focus, but with Luke, I think, or Marcus, or was it Matthew? Anyway, with Jesus in Gethsemane praying, and you say that this is basically the most authentic being towards death one can be in his praying, where the sweat drops down like blood, and he knowing that this is the end of him in the world. And then one other thing that popped in my mind when you spoke about being towards death and said, well, why not being towards birth? What do you think about being towards birth? Is it something different from being in the world, the Dasein is, or is being towards birth not yet Dasein? So these are the few questions I have for you.
And we only have 3 minutes to kind of conclude this before we get ready for your great talk, Hakeem. The reason I lay out all those other characters is that I want to make sure that Heidegger is not resuming any of these guys' positions. But it's Socrates, we can have a whole course on trying to interpret what's up there. Derrida does this in the Death Penalty lectures. I try to come to grips with it. But, you can take from Plato that what Socrates is a great guy. He's saying, look, I'm not trying to get out of the death sentence. Friends, you're telling me that's like a dustman saying, hey, you can get out of this. And that's death in the Greek polis, which is the exile, right? But he's saying, look, it's a point of time when I make this decision, even if I myself am fooling myself to think I can get out of this, escaping the body. And for Socrates, he has some things to say about talking to all these other dead philosophers and constantly thinking and the sleepfulness, etc. But in the Jesus point for your Gospels, for him to, if he authentic being towards death, and again, this is not Heidegger. I think Heidegger is the guy we got to get to if we can even understand what he's talking about. This is what Ian's trying to do his whole life, about being towards death. That's the authentic understanding of that, away from demising, perishing, and the depressive modes and all the other paradigms. There's everything else that's opening up there. But I'm going to come back to Ian because Ian, you have that ethical register that you want to teach us about, which is still unclear to me. But it's not even the Jesus-logical moment where he's like, the dude is about to die, and you'd think he's just talking to the Father. And here he is invoking his disciples who he loves. And he's talking about the maintenance of not his legacy or how he's going to be remembered, but the proleptic of what that possibility of death is going to be if you can't focus on that love and truth problem that he has. Good for him. He's the incarnation of that. So we're not talking about the ancient Greek, all of philosophy really, and the traditional kind of morality and ethics conversations up to Nietzsche. We're not talking about Christianity. To come to Heidegger, this being a whole, this attestation which is missing, remember that last quote, And the Zorga, which is going to be the true test because it's our anticipatory resoluteness, our thrownness, the uncanniness of our individuation. Death is impending, certain, indefinite, non-relational, not to be outstripped. The coming, the Kunft. And then I'm my having business, I'm my business. You know, I'm always with my past as is. But it's that process of temporalization, the equiprimordiality of the temporal ecstasies. It's the only way I can conclude here is that uncanniness of being outside yourself. I'm outside my own skin. That's the call from without. I cannot just accept being here. As much as I might for a moment be happy. Look, I finally became a dad at the age of 53 compared to you all. You know what that's like? That's crazy. You try doing it. It's exhausting. And yet, long before the kids, I'm being towards my birth has not been trying to remember my biological birth, but being caught up in the possibility of the thrownness in an authentic way as another end to which I can be relieved of either the good conscience or the bad conscience. I'm not fated to my memory of myself. Nietzsche says that. You just keep pounding the beast, get to remember that you've got to pay a debt. Oh, the conscience pops out of that. Good for Nietzsche. It's a great tale to tell. It's more profound than that. There's a sweetness and a wholeness to Heidegger's conscience. Yes, Ian, my friend. Yep.
Turn on your mic.
Sorry, yeah, I don't know. I'll be super fast because I think we're out of time, but that was awesome as always, Raj. So I want to ask you just to think about if I don't know if you have time to answer. If you have a ready answer, hit me. But it's sort of the Derridian question, which is, I love the way you talked about Pontius Pilate and the silence that Christ greets him with to his question, and the connection of that to the Wissen ist ein or Gewissen ist ein Wissen. Conscience is a science or a knowing. This kind of this idea that keeping silent is the most authentic form of saying. And what does it know? What's the Gewissen? Is it like a gathered wisdom? Is it a knowing? Is it the acting? Is it the reconnecting to the world in Entschlossenheit? Because that does Jesus, how do you understand all that?
Well, the 2 second, because you don't want to take about King's time. The more time we take, you're going to be pushed out, Ian, because you're culminating the conference. But keep in mind with that, the agony scene is Jesus talking to the Father and the Father not answering. Hey, take this cup. And even the forsakenness on the cross. So the idiomata is the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit all talking to each other. That's the doctrine, right? Well, how come he's silent? What does that say about him? Not just you can't represent the Father, and that's the absolute. It's don't make an idol of it. It's obviously the Hebraic God that Jesus is the incarnation of, the first commandment. But if he's being silent, and then the incarnation of that silence is the silence that's repeated or doubled in the pilot, but it's almost like he's just saying, Pilate, you're a joke. I'm not going to talk to a guy like you. Snake Plissken, Escape from New York, started to go on a tangent. Who are you and why are we talking? you're the only one I got. Not to go off on that, but what is that like? That the space of the silence is what is don't let that Dasman come in and fill in the content, which is the nothing, right? But the nothing is positive because I have to constantly, do I want to die every single moment of this inauthenticity to be shaken out of it? Is that the eternal cycle of the ring? And then occasionally I pop out like, I can't believe I'm even here and alive. Why am I 55 years old? Why am I not still one or two? Or I thought I was dead. Like, what am I doing here? It's like, oh yeah, I'm here. Okay, yeah, I got all these commitments. This, we talk about it. It's this inversion. But I think to contrast with both Kierkegaard and Jesus and Socrates, what you have here is the full potentiality of a renewed metaphysics. And I want to go down this path. That who's going to ultimately talk is the ecstatic relationship of all those ecstasies. That was never fleshed out. And the beauty of articulating being towards birth as both ends attesting to themselves, which doesn't make any sense. I know, it'll take time. How can my birth and death talk to each other? Well, that's the stretch of this. They're communicating. And sorry, Akeem, they're not communicating in a way that will tell you, hey, this is the reason you were born, just like this is the reason you got to die, Socrates. No one's going to tell you why you were born. But guess what? Deal with it. It sucks. Not because you had a terrible life. Maybe you do. People were abused. Or maybe you don't. You have a great life. But either way, if you can't deal with the uncanniness of your birth, you sure as hell are not going to be able to have the authentic relationship to the uncanniness of your infinitude and have some superficial idea of death. Well, I'm going to flee from it. I'm going to accept it. I'm going to be this. It doesn't matter to me. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, I'll close there. Sorry, Ian, that's too short.
It's a good ending to your presentation.